What if Britain's most beloved entertainers were hiding secrets so disturbing that even today, the truth makes us recoil? Court records, criminal convictions, testimonies that shattered a generation. 17 stars, 17 secrets that finally came to light. And Jimmy Savile was just the beginning. Jimmy Savile, the system built to protect him. Savile had engineered a system of access that would eventually be recognized as one of the most extensive patterns of exploitation in British history. He had a knack for being just visible enough to be trusted, just strange enough that people dismissed their unease as prejudice against his eccentricity. For decades, Jimmy Savile was Britain's most famous eccentric, instantly recognizable in his trademark tracksuit with a cigar perpetually in hand. He raised millions of pounds for hospitals through charity marathons and sponsored appeals. Children across Britain knew him as the host of Jim'll Fix It, the magical Saturday evening program where he made dreams come true. The public wrote him off as a bit odd, certainly, with his peculiar mannerisms and that unsettling grin. But harmless. The BBC wrote him checks for decades, and institutions, hospitals, children's homes, broadcasters handed him keys to areas where vulnerable people lived and received care. Behind the charitable facade, he was using his celebrity status to commit offenses that would span 6 decades. He volunteered at hospitals not purely from altruism, but because it provided unlimited access to vulnerable patients. He befriended security staff and administrators, making himself indispensable, a fixture who belonged everywhere and could go anywhere. After Savile passed away on October 29, 2011, at age 84, the carefully maintained facade began to crack. Within a year, a documentary investigation prompted hundreds of people to come forward with allegations stretching back to the 1960s. Operation U-Tree, the Metropolitan Police investigation launched in October 2012, would eventually document 450 alleged victims, ranging in age from 5 to 75 at the time of the offenses. The peak of his offending occurred between 1966 and 1976, though allegations span from the 1950s to 2006. One victim, testifying decades later, described how Savile had looked her in the eye and said, "Nobody will believe you. I'm Jimmy Savile." She was 9 years old, and she'd been right to be afraid. Because for 60 years, nobody believed the victims. The institutions that had enabled him scrambled to understand their failure. The BBC commissioned the Dame Janet Smith Review, published in 2016, which confirmed that the corporation had missed numerous opportunities to stop Savile. Staff members had reported concerns. Rumors had circulated for years, but his celebrity, his charity work, and his connections had created an immunity that victims' voices couldn't penetrate. The question everyone asked was, why didn't they see it? The devastating answer: they did see it. They just didn't want to be the first to say it out loud. Because to acknowledge what Savile was doing meant admitting that your favorite childhood program was hosted by someone using it for access. It meant your charitable donations had funded that access. It meant that the eccentric uncle of British television had been hiding in plain sight, protected by collective willful blindness. The Savile case didn't just expose one man's crimes. It revealed how completely celebrity immunity could corrupt every institution it touched. But at least Savile's crimes were eventually documented. Our next case? It remains unsolved to this day. A young man was found lifeless in a pool. 8 people at the party, and not a single one willing to tell the truth about what happened that night. Michael Barrymore, the mystery no one can explain. On the evening of March 31, 2001, 31-year-old Stuart Lubbock attended a party at the Essex home of Michael Barrymore. Barrymore was then at the absolute peak of his career as Britain's golden boy of light entertainment. Barrymore had spent the 1990s making millions laugh with his manic energy on shows like Strike It Lucky and My Kind of People. As when he came out as gay in 1995, the British public had been remarkably supportive, embracing him with the same warmth they'd always shown. He seemed untouchable, a national treasure whose Saturday night ratings proved his enduring appeal. The party that night was small, just 8 people total. But what happened in those hours would destroy Barrymore's career and leave Stuart Lubbock's family with questions they're still asking more than 2 decades later. In the early hours of March 31st, Lubbock was found floating in Barrymore's swimming pool. By the time emergency services arrived, he had passed away. The post-mortem examination revealed injuries consistent with a serious assault. That detail is crucial. This wasn't drowning. This was violence, along with alcohol, substances, and ecstasy in his system. The physical evidence suggested something terrible had occurred, but the accounts from the 8 people present that night conflicted wildly. Some details changed between initial statements and later interviews. And here's what haunts investigators to this day. Forensic evidence suggested someone had tried to clean the scene. But who? And why would they, if it was just a tragic accident? Police found evidence that suggested attempts to alter what emergency services would find. The coroner recorded an open verdict, a legal conclusion that means the cause of the incident remains unclear due to insufficient evidence. It's a phrase that somehow sounds both evasive and damning, leaving everyone in a permanent state of uncertainty. Barrymore was arrested in June 2007, but released without charge. Despite extensive investigation, no one has ever been prosecuted in connection with Stuart Lubbock's passing. In 2020, Essex police arrested another man, not Barrymore, but he too was released without charges filed. What makes the Barrymore case so disturbing isn't a conviction or even a clear accusation. It's the permanent ambiguity, the liminal space between crime and scandal where nothing is technically proven, but nothing can be forgotten. Barrymore's career never recovered. The man who once commanded Saturday night television found himself unable to work, his name forever associated with an unresolved tragedy. Stuart Lubbock's father, Terry, spent the remaining 20 years of his life campaigning for answers, appearing in documentaries and press conferences, never giving up hope that someone would finally tell the truth about what happened to his son. Terry Lubbock passed away in March 2021 without getting the closure he sought. The case remains open, technically unsolved, a reminder that sometimes the most haunting truths are the ones we never quite learn. For Barrymore, it demonstrates how a career can be destroyed through suspicion rather than conviction, through questions that linger in the absence of answers. For Stuart Lubbock's family, it represents a justice system unable to provide resolution, leaving them trapped in grief compounded by uncertainty. If Stuart Lubbock's case showed us how mysteries can haunt forever, our next story reveals something different: how British law itself became the criminal, prosecuting love and calling it justice. Peter Wyngarde, criminalized for existing. In January 2018, when Peter Wyngarde passed away at 90, his obituaries were remarkably quiet about one thing: the 1975 convictions that had destroyed the career of one of British television's most sophisticated stars, not because it wasn't known, but because what happened to Wyngarde exposes something Britain would prefer to forget. In 1975, he was convicted of gross indecency in a public toilet at Gloucester bus station, a legal term that in the language of the time meant he had been caught in a same-gender encounter. He was fined £75, processed quietly through the magistrate's court, and then discreetly shuffled from public sight by an industry that suddenly found him less bankable. In the 1960s and 70s, Peter Wyngarde had embodied a very specific kind of British sophistication. His mustache seemed to arrive 5 minutes before he did. His velvet voice could sell anything from spy fiction to surreal dreamscapes. His portrayal of Jason King in Department S and the spin-off series made him a cult icon of mod style. He was at camp before camp was fully understood, charming in a way that felt both dangerous and safe. The perfect embodiment of that era's fascination with eccentric gentleman adventurers. What's crucial to understand is that there was no victim in Wyngarde's case. No one was harmed, no predatory behavior. This was simply a man criminalized for his identity, for seeking connection in a society that had made it illegal for people like him to exist openly. The Offences Act of 1967 had partially decriminalized same-gender relationships in England and Wales, but only for private acts between men over 21. Public encounters, even between consenting adults, remained criminal offenses until 2003. Wyngarde's career didn't collapse in a dramatic scandal. Instead, it eroded slowly. The leading roles dried up. The glamorous film offers became guest appearances on lower-budget productions. Foreign markets and exploitation films replaced the prestige work. He never spoke publicly about his conviction or his private life, maintaining a dignified silence that somehow made the whole situation more poignant. He simply faded from the spotlight he'd once commanded, a reminder that British society could accept camp as performance, but not as identity. Wyngarde lived another 43 years after that conviction, passing away in January 2018 at age 90. His obituaries were respectfully vague about the 1975 incident, focusing instead on his contributions to British television. And here's what makes this story truly devastating. There was no victim, no harm done to anyone, just a man criminalized for existing. The conviction didn't protect anyone. It just destroyed a career and forced a talented performer to spend decades looking over his shoulder, wondering if his carefully guarded privacy would be violated again. But just 2 decades before Wyngarde's arrest, even theatrical knighthood offered no protection from the same persecution. And what happened next revealed something extraordinary about public compassion. Sir John Gielgud, when the audience chose love over law. Just days after his conviction, Sir John Gielgud walked onto the stage at Liverpool Playhouse, terrified. He hadn't spoken a single line when the applause started. It grew and grew until the entire audience was on their feet. They were applauding a convicted criminal, a man who had pleaded guilty 4 days earlier. But they were also sending a message. When Sir John Gielgud was arrested on October 21st, 1953, he had been a knight of the realm for exactly 4 months. He was a theater aristocrat, the man whose voice defined Shakespeare for a generation, who had played Hamlet and King Lear and Prospero with such authority that he seemed to embody the very soul of British drama. He represented the cultural peak of the nation, knighted for services to the stage in June of that year. And then, in a public lavatory in Chelsea's Sloane Square, his private life collided catastrophically with the law. He was charged with persistently importuning male persons for immoral purposes, the legal language for soliciting a same-gender encounter. At West London Magistrates Court, Gielgud pleaded guilty and was fined £10. He was devastated by the public exposure, attempting to retreat into obscurity, convinced his career was over. For a man who had spent his life in the spotlight, the humiliation of being prosecuted for his private desires seemed unbearable. That standing ovation didn't erase the conviction or the humiliation, but it allowed Gielgud to continue working. His career carried on virtually uninterrupted for another 47 years. He appeared in films, continued his stage work, and became beloved by a new generation through movies like Arthur and Prospero's books. When he passed away in May 2000 at age 96, the obituaries focused overwhelmingly on his artistic achievements. The 1953 conviction was mentioned, if at all, as a minor footnote to a towering legacy. Gielgud outlived the laws that had criminalized him. The Offences Act of 1967 partially decriminalized same-gender relationships, though even then, full equality remained decades away. His story illustrates both the cruelty of laws that punished identity and the capacity for public compassion to transcend those laws. The Liverpool audience chose humanity over legality, decided that talent and dignity mattered more than who someone loved. In a list full of darkness, Gielgud's standing ovation stands as a rare moment of light, proof that sometimes society can be better than its laws. The audience forgave Gielgud because they understood the law was unjust, but forgiveness would prove impossible when the crimes were unforgivable and the victims were children. And some of those children had been carrying shame for decades, waiting for someone to finally believe them. Stuart Hall, television's Uncle Hid, 18 Years of Crimes. Stuart Hall had a laugh like polished brass and the kind of face that comforted post-war Britain. He was television's uncle, the jolly host of It's a Knockout, a beloved sports commentator whose voice defined Saturday afternoons. On It's a Knockout, he'd laugh at contestants covered in foam, slipping on obstacles. His delight seemed genuine, infectious, safe. Families gathered around televisions on Saturday afternoons to watch Stuart Hall bring joy to ordinary people. That's the man everyone trusted. Meanwhile, the system around him did the one thing predators dream of. They confused likability with safety, and Stuart Hall built an entire second life in the spaces that confusion created. In BBC dressing rooms, in backstage corridors, and his own car. In December 2013, Stuart Hall pleaded guilty to 14 counts of indecent assault on 13 girls. The youngest victim was 9 years old. The pattern stretched from 1967 to 1985. 18 years of systematic predation, enabled by his access and protected by his reputation. In the courtroom, one victim, now in her 50s, described how Hall had told her she was special before assaulting her in his car. She'd carried that word for 40 years, wondering if she'd somehow invited what happened. The guilt had nearly destroyed her marriage, her relationship with her own children. And all that time, Stuart Hall had been on the radio every Saturday, laughing. The locations of his crimes are particularly telling. BBC dressing rooms, backstage corridors, his car. These were spaces where his celebrity granted him privacy. The offenses weren't random acts of opportunity, they were part of a pattern. Operation U-Tree, the investigation launched in the wake of the Savile revelations, had given victims the courage to come forward. Hall was sentenced to 15 months in prison, but that wasn't the end of it. Additional charges emerged, 17 more offenses against additional victims. He received an additional 30-month sentence. In total, he served half his sentence before being released in December 2015. The victims' testimonies painted a picture of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And the institutions, the BBC, the production companies, the networks, had created the perfect environment for him to operate. Stuart Hall became a blueprint for understanding how predators use celebrity as camouflage, how institutions enable harm by refusing to look too closely at their stars. Hall's guilty plea validated what his victims had known for decades, and suddenly, other voices from that same BBC era didn't sound quite so trustworthy. Dave Lee Travis. When one conviction changed everything. Dave Lee Travis made his name spinning records and cracking jokes in a voice as smooth as custard. He was a staple of 1970s and 80s BBC Radio 1, one of those disc jockeys who seemed to embody a particular era of British broadcasting. They called him the Hairy Cornflake, as if an absurd nickname could somehow make a person harmless, could transform a grown man into a cuddly character from a children's program. The illusion worked for decades, then the culture shifted. The floodgates opened in the wake of Savile and Stuart Hall, and suddenly, old jokes weren't funny anymore. Behaviors that had been dismissed as just a bit cheeky, or that's just how things were back then, came under new scrutiny. The nostalgia that had protected certain behaviors, the casual grabbing, the inappropriate comments, the assumption that women in the industry were there for the entertainment of the men, that nostalgia expired almost overnight. In September 2014, Dave Lee Travis was convicted at Southwark Crown Court of one count of indecent assault on a woman at BBC Television Centre in 1995. He had been charged with 12 offenses and was cleared of 11. But this single count stuck. The jury deliberated for 27 hours before reaching their verdict on that one charge. He received a 3-month prison sentence, suspended for 2 years, and was ordered to pay £1,000 in compensation to his victim. Here's what made Dave Lee Travis different from Savile and Stuart Hall. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong, even after the conviction, even after the 27-hour jury deliberation. In his mind, and in the minds of thousands who defended him online, this was just how things used to be. A quick grope, a bit of fun, nothing serious. But one woman, who had been told for 20 years that she was overreacting, that she should feel flattered, finally got to hear a jury say, "You're not crazy. He was wrong, and we believe you." That's why one conviction mattered. The conviction wasn't the sweeping downfall of Jimmy Savile. Travis wasn't facing hundreds of allegations or decades of systematic predation. But in the context of Operation U-Tree and the broader reckoning happening within British broadcasting, that one conviction became deeply symbolic. It represented the end of the boys will be boys excuse, the end of an era when certain behaviors could be dismissed as harmless fun. The different era defense that Travis's legal team had leaned on heavily collapsed under the weight of one victim's courage to come forward and one jury's willingness to believe her. What made the conviction particularly significant was what it said about acceptable behavior at the BBC. Here was a man who had worked for decades at the corporation, whose assault had occurred on BBC premises in 1995, not the distant past, but well within living memory. Long after society supposedly knew better, it confirmed what many had suspected, that the culture at the BBC hadn't just enabled Savile and Stuart Hall. It had created an environment where harassment and assault could occur with regularity because the perpetrators believed they were untouchable. Travis represented the end of the different times excuse, but the next conviction proved something even more disturbing, that intelligence could camouflage evil just as effectively as charm. Chris Langham, when intellectualism became a shield. Chris Langham was the clever one, the satirist's satirist, the writer behind Not the 9 O'Clock News and The Muppet Show. He won a BAFTA for his role in the thick of it, playing a bumbling politician with such uncomfortable authenticity that you could almost believe he understood power from the inside. He was self-deprecating in interviews, awkward in a way that made awkward people feel seen. His entire persona was built on being uncomfortable with power types, the intellectual who questioned authority and made you think while you laughed. In November 2007, Chris Langham was convicted at Maidstone Crown Court of 15 counts of downloading the most severe category of prohibited material involving minors. His defense was as intellectually constructed as you might expect from a writer of his caliber. He claimed he had been researching a role for a potential project with Chris Morris, the controversial satirist, a drama that would require him to understand a certain mindset. Morris confirmed no such project had ever been commissioned or seriously discussed. The court and jury rejected Langham's defense emphatically, and even if you could justify viewing such material for research purposes, which you can't, the sheer volume Langham had accumulated suggested something far different from academic inquiry. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison, reduced to 6 months on appeal. He served 10 weeks before his release. In 2008, he appealed the conviction itself, arguing that his intent mattered. The Court of Appeal disagreed, upholding the conviction. He was placed on the offenders register for 10 years. The BBC immediately pulled all reruns of The Thick of It from their schedule. His BAFTA, won just a year earlier, became a source of embarrassment for everyone involved. Langham's case is important because it demonstrates that predatory behavior doesn't arrive wearing a leering expression and twirling a villain's mustache. Sometimes it arrives in footnotes and self-deprecation, hiding behind intellectual justifications and artistic pretensions. The man who had built his career on satirizing the powerful had used his intelligence not to expose wrongdoing, but to rationalize his own. His fall was absolute. The work he'd created became untouchable, tainted by association with what he'd done. And here's what haunts everyone who worked with him. Chris Langham played a politician. He performed awkwardly. He made people laugh at the absurdity of power. While privately, he was involved with material documenting the exploitation of children. Children who had no choice, no script, no way to turn off what was happening to them. Those children are still out there, still living with what was done to them. While Langham served 10 weeks and walked free. We're 7 stories in, and already the scope of what was hidden is staggering. If these revelations are opening your eyes to truths long buried by British broadcasting, please subscribe. These stories need to be told, and your support ensures we can continue. Let's continue. Langham's fall was swift and absolute. But our next case poses an uncomfortable question. Can television truly offer redemption to someone who had taken a life? And if so, what about the victim's family forced to watch it happen? Leslie Grantham, when television rewrote a harmful man's story. On December 3rd, 1966, 19-year-old Leslie Grantham was stationed in West Germany with the British Army. During an attempted robbery of a taxi driver named Felix Rees in Osnabrück, Grantham shot and ended the man's life. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served 10 years, during which he took advantage of educational programs and studied acting at Lay Hill Prison. It's the kind of backstory that usually ends a life rather than launches a second act. But television, it turns out, has a remarkable talent for recycling troubled pasts when the ratings are right. After his release in 1977, Grantham worked in theater before being cast in 1984 as Dirty Den Watts in the BBC's new soap opera EastEnders. The role made him a national phenomenon. He played a pub landlord who was charming and ruthless in equal measure. The kind of villain audiences loved to watch. The Christmas episode of 1986, in which Den served his wife Angie with divorce papers, was watched by 24.3 million people. Still the highest-rated episode of any British soap opera ever broadcast. The British public embraced the redemption narrative enthusiastically. Here was a man who had made a terrible mistake as a teenager, paid his debt to society, and rebuilt his life into something meaningful. Britain loves a comeback story, especially when it comes with compelling drama and record-breaking ratings. For nearly 2 decades, the conviction seemed like ancient history, something Grantham had overcome through talent and determination. The fairy tale ended in 2004, when Grantham was caught up in a scandal involving inappropriate online conversations. The details were sordid rather than criminal, but they were enough to force his departure from EastEnders. When he passed away in July 2018, the obituaries focused primarily on his television work. Felix Reese, the taxi driver whose life ended in 1966, was rarely mentioned. His name had been almost entirely erased from the narrative of Grantham's life. Felix Reese left behind a widow and 2 children in Germany. They watched as their loved one's taker became a British television icon. They saw 24.3 million people tune in to watch him pretend to be a lovable villain, and they were expected to accept that this was justice, that 10 years was enough, that fame was redemption. This raises uncomfortable questions about redemption and memory. Did Grantham deserve a second chance after serving his sentence? Perhaps. But did that second chance require collective amnesia about Felix Reese? Did the entertainment value of Dirty Den justify a nation forgetting that the actor playing him had taken an innocent life? The industry bet that the public would choose entertainment over memory, ratings over justice. And they were right. For decades, it worked perfectly. Grantham became proof that with enough talent and the right role, television could help you escape almost anything. Grantham's story forces uncomfortable questions about when second chances become convenient. But our next case offers no resolution at all, only permanent, maddening ambiguity. And sometimes that uncertainty is the most unsettling truth of all. Wilfrid Brambell, forever frozen in uncertainty. Here's where things get complicated and uncomfortable. Wilfrid Brambell was the original dirty old man, literally. That was his character on Steptoe and Son, the BBC sitcom that ran from 1962 to 1974. He played Albert Steptoe, a bitter, conniving junk dealer forever feuding with his son in what became one of Britain's most beloved comedies. Off-screen, Brambell was a different creature entirely, private, polite, elusive, meticulous about separating his public character from his private life. But Brambell wasn't just acting the role of a crusty, closeted loner. In November 1962, he was convicted of persistently importuning for immoral purposes after being caught soliciting men in a public lavatory in Shepherd's Bush. He was fined £25 at West London Magistrates Court. The conviction made headlines briefly, but the BBC and the public alike seemed willing to pretend it had never happened, so long as the laughs on Steptoe and Son kept coming. The show continued uninterrupted for another 12 years. That conviction tells a straightforward story. A man persecuted under unjust laws, a man who deserves sympathy. But decades after his passing, when biographers began investigating more deeply, they found something else. Whispers from people who'd worked with him, claims about behavior unrelated to consenting adults, suggestions of something that would place him in a very different category. Not one of these allegations went to court. The people who made them have since passed away. Brambell himself was gone by 1985, never having addressed any of the claims. And so we're left investigating a cold case with no living witnesses, no way to verify, no way to dismiss. What we can say with certainty is this: Brambell lived in an era when privacy wasn't just respected, it was weaponized, when the stigma around any revelation about identity created a shield that protected both the innocent and the guilty equally. Some historians believe he was simply a gay man, persecuted by barbaric laws. Others point to patterns in the unverified accounts that suggest something more troubling may have occurred. The truth? We'll never know. Brambell passed away in January 1985, long before modern investigative techniques or cultural attitudes could bring clarity. He remains frozen in ambiguity, a cautionary tale without closure. That uncertainty? That's the point. Some stories don't have clean endings. Some questions outlive everyone who knew the answers. And sometimes we're left holding two incompatible possibilities, unable to reconcile them, forced to admit that justice and truth don't always arrive together. His story reminds us that real life rarely provides the clear-cut narratives we crave. Sometimes we're left with confirmed facts that demand sympathy, unverified rumors that demand caution, and no way to reconcile the two into a comfortable conclusion. But the next case moved from gray to black and white in a courtroom, where a comedian sued to clear his name, put his reputation on trial, and lost everything. Freddy Starr, the lawsuit that backfired spectacularly. Freddy Starr was British television's answer to chaos, a wild-eyed, unfiltered comedian whose variety show performances in the 70s, 80s, and 90s seemed always on the verge of spinning completely out of control. He was slapstick meets surreal, a human punchline whose most famous moment came when tabloids falsely claimed he'd eaten someone's pet hamster, a story he denied, but which somehow summed up his entire persona. He was just crude enough to make you question your taste, just unpredictable enough to keep you watching. In the wake of the Savile revelations, a woman named Karen Ward came forward with an allegation. She claimed that in 1974, when she was 15 years old, Freddy Starr had groped her in Jimmy Savile's dressing room at BBC Television Center. Starr vehemently denied the allegation. And then, in October 2015, he made a decision that would define the final months of his life. He sued Karen Ward for defamation, seeking to clear his name through the courts. The High Court trial heard evidence from both parties over several days. In court, Karen Ward described what happened in that BBC dressing room in 1974. She'd been excited to meet Freddy Starr. She was 15. He was famous. And Jimmy Savile, who she now realizes was likely facilitating, had introduced them. Then Starr's hands were on her, And when she froze, confused about whether this was somehow normal in show business, Savile had laughed, like it was all part of the joke. She carried that confusion for 41 years. Ward testified about what had happened. Starr maintained his denial. On October 21, 2015, Mr. Justice Nicole delivered his judgment. He ruled that Ward's allegations were substantially true and therefore not defamatory. In legal terms, this meant the court believed her account over Starr's denial. Starr was ordered to pay Ward's substantial legal costs. The ruling wasn't a criminal conviction, which confused some members of the public. But in practical terms, the message was crystal clear. A high court judge had examined the evidence and concluded that Karen Ward was telling the truth and Freddy Starr was not. The legal nuance mattered less than the outcome. Starr had tried to use the courts to vindicate himself, and the strategy had backfired completely. Rather than clearing his name, he had secured a permanent judicial finding that the assault had occurred. Before a high court judge finally said, "You were right, he was wrong," this happened. Freddy Starr passed away on May 9, 2016, just 7 months after the judgment. His final legacy became that of a man who tried to sue his way to redemption and instead left behind a court record confirming what he'd spent his last years denying. For Karen Ward, the judgment represented vindication after decades of carrying the truth alone. Proof that speaking up, even when it takes 40 years, can still matter. Starr's courtroom defeat proved truth could prevail even without criminal prosecution. But not all shocking truths were about crimes. Some were about the psychological cost of hiding who you really were. And for our next star, that cost lasted 35 years. Frankie Howerd, 35 years of hidden love. For 35 years, Dennis Hamer was Frankie Howerd's business manager. That's what the press releases said. But Dennis Hamer was also the love of Frankie Howerd's life, his partner, the person who held him through nervous breakdowns and depression. And Dennis couldn't even attend Frankie's funeral as a widower, just as the manager. For 46 years, Frankie Howerd was a fixture of British comedy. His stammering camp delivery defined a certain style of entertainment. Twitter has not become a national catchphrase. His portrayal of Lucio in Up Pompeii made him beloved to multiple generations. He seemed so openly camp that audiences assumed it was all performance. Harmless double entendre that winked at certain possibilities without ever confirming them. But behind the public persona, Frankie Howerd was carrying a secret that consumed him with anxiety for more than 3 decades. He was a gay man in an era when that identity was first criminal and later professional self-destruction. And he was in love with Dennis Hamer, a relationship that began in the late 1950s and continued until Howard's passing in April 1992. They lived together in Kensington. Hamer managed Howard's career. To the press and public, that's all he was, a business manager. The truth that they were partners, that their relationship had lasted 35 years, remained carefully guarded. Even after the Offences Act of 1967 partially decriminalized same-gender relationships, being publicly out remained career self-destruction for entertainers. The British public might accept camp as a performance, but they weren't ready to accept it as an identity. The psychological cost was severe. Howerd suffered from documented depression throughout his career. In 1966, he experienced a nervous breakdown serious enough to require hospitalization. Frankie Howerd passed away on April 19, 1992, at age 75. Only in the years that followed did the full truth of his relationship with Dennis Hamer become public knowledge. The tragedy of Howard's life wasn't that he was camp. That was glorious, authentic, revolutionary. The tragedy was that he had to hide the love that sustained him, had to present his partner of 35 years as merely a business associate. He made millions laugh while unable to publicly acknowledge the person who made him happiest. And that dichotomy extracted a price that manifested in depression, breakdowns, and decades of constant vigilance. Howard's camp comedy was gloriously real, and so was the pain of hiding the love behind it. But for some women in British entertainment, the hiding came with an even more violent price. And the cost was measured not just in psychological damage, but in bruises that makeup couldn't cover. Diana Dors, the armor that couldn't protect. Diana Dors was 14 when her mother pushed her into show business. By 16, she was being groomed by older men in the industry who saw a blonde girl desperate for attention and knew exactly how to exploit that desperation. By 20, she'd learned the only way to survive was to become what they wanted before they could force her into it. The bombshell persona, it was armor, and like all armor, it was heavy. She was born Diana Fluck in 1931, a name she changed for obvious reasons once she entered show business. By the 1950s and 60s, Diana Dors had become Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe. Assuming Monroe had grown up tougher, talked faster, and understood from an early age exactly how male attention could be weaponized. She was the platinum blonde bombshell of British cinema, a pinup whose image sold more magazines than her actual films justified. She was a scandal magnet who seemed to have more tabloid headlines than quality screen time. But that was precisely the point. Diana Dors understood that in the business of fame, controversy was currency. But behind the carefully managed image of a woman in control of her physical appeal and her career, biographers and journalists would later describe a life riddled with exploitation. The party culture of the 1950s and 60s, particularly around certain celebrity circles, was an environment where consent blurred into currency, where young women became decoration at gatherings, where boundaries dissolved in clouds of alcohol and pills. From the moment that 14-year-old girl entered the industry, she was learning rules that no child should have to learn. That attention was power, that physical appeal was currency, that the only way to maintain any control was to offer it before someone took it. The accounts of her 3 marriages tell a story of manipulation and control, particularly her first marriage to Dennis Hamilton, which multiple sources describe as abusive. Diana Dors's later years were marked by financial struggles despite decades of fame. Her 3 marriages all ended badly. The industry that had built her up as Britain's symbol of physical allure abandoned her as public tastes shifted, and she aged past the narrow window where female physical appeal was considered marketable rather than embarrassing. She passed away from ovarian cancer on May 4th, 1984, at age 52. She's remembered today with a kind of melancholic admiration, a recognition that she was a woman who had everything fame could offer: beauty, recognition, newspaper coverage, except the things that actually mattered. Protection, genuine power, the freedom to age without being discarded. She sold the image of control like it was armor, only to discover that armor was paper thin and provided no real defense against the industry that consumed her. Her legacy is complicated, marked by questions about survival and exploitation that may be impossible to answer definitively decades after her passing. Dors showed how imagery could trap women in cycles they couldn't escape, but The Next Star proved that even supposedly cheeky comedy roles came with a painful, hidden price tag, and sometimes that price was paid in blood. Barbara Windsor, the giggle that hid the bruises. Barbara Windsor was packaged as Britain's giggle, the wide-eyed blonde who appeared in 9 carry-on films between 1964 and 1974. She was the innuendo queen, famous for the losing bikini top scene in Carry-On Camping that became one of British cinema's most iconic moments. The camera adored her, the public adored her. Behind that carefully crafted image, Windsor was living a very different life. Her 2000 autobiography described relationships marked by manipulation and control. Most notably, her marriage to Ronnie Knight, which lasted from 1964 to 1985, included documented physical harm. In her autobiography, Windsor described one incident where Knight had hurt her so badly she couldn't film for a week. The production had to be delayed, and when they asked why, she lied, said she'd fallen downstairs. Because that's what you did. You protected the man who hurt you. You smiled for the camera, you giggled on cue, and you went home to more of the same. The culture that produced the Carry-On films expected women in comedies to tolerate whatever came with the role. Discomfort was dismissed as prudishness. Complaints were rebranded as inability to take a joke. Modern reassessments of Windsor's career tend to feel almost apologetic. The apologetic tone comes from recognizing that the culture which celebrated her also created and normalized the conditions that hurt her. She was adored by millions, but that adoration didn't translate into protection. Windsor found later happiness playing Peggy Mitchell in EastEnders from 1994 to 2016. The role allowed her to age, to play toughness and vulnerability in ways the Carry-On films never permitted. When she passed away in December 2020 at age 83, the public mourning focused on her talent, her laugh, her ability to light up a screen. Her legacy reminds us that being turned into a symbol, even a beloved one, carries costs that audiences rarely see. The giggle was real, the talent was undeniable, but the pain behind both was something Windsor carried largely alone. Windsor's pain was hidden behind laughter and the camera's loving gaze. But for some male stars, the darkness wasn't hidden at all. It was performed, marketed, and somehow sold as entertainment. And the question remains, how much cruelty will we forgive if the art is good enough? We're more than halfway through these 17 stories, and the patterns are becoming clear. Institutional protection, cultural enabling, and voices finally being heard. Which of these stories shocked you most? The predators who were protected or the lovers who were persecuted? Share your thoughts in the comments. Peter Sellers, When Genius Became a License to Destroy. In 1980, when Britt Ekland published her memoir, True Brit, the world learned something shocking about Peter Sellers. The genius everyone called irreplaceable had spent their marriage manipulating her so thoroughly that she'd questioned her own sanity. He'd tell her she looked terrible, then deny saying it hours later. He'd rage at her in private, then play the devoted husband in public. He'd undermine her confidence, then call her unstable when she got upset. And when she tried to leave, he threatened to destroy her career. And the industry? They believed him, because Peter Sellers was too valuable to lose. Peter Sellers was a man of 1,000 faces, and according to those who knew him best, none of those faces quite belonged to him. He could become Inspector Clouseau, Dr. Strangelove, or Chance the Gardener in being there with such totality that the characters seemed to consume the actor. He was brilliant, indispensable, a comedic genius whose talent the film industry treated as irreplaceable. And that irreplaceability, that sense that the world needed Peter Sellers more than Peter Sellers needed to be a decent human being, gave him permission to hurt people without consequence. Multiple biographers, working independently and drawing on interviews with different sources, paint a remarkably consistent picture. His first wife, Anne Howe, described controlling and jealous behavior that made their marriage unbearable. Britt Ekland's 1980 memoir, True Brit, detailed psychological manipulation during their marriage. His children, Michael and Sarah Sellers, gave interviews describing an emotionally absent and harsh father whose affection seemed to evaporate the moment cameras stopped rolling. His children would later describe the same pattern. Their father was someone who consumed everyone close to him, leaving nothing but emptiness in his wake. But none of that mattered, because the punchlines were too good. Those who worked with Sellers walked on eggshells. Herbert Lom, his co-star in the Pink Panther films, documented the on-set volatility and mood swings. Directors learned to structure shooting schedules around Sellers' psychological state, knowing that a bad day could derail entire productions. The industry didn't just tolerate this behavior, it romanticized it. He was a difficult genius, the troubled artist, the man whose brilliance came with a price that other people had to pay. Peter Sellers passed away from a heart attack on July 24, 1980 at age 54, leaving behind a complicated legacy. His performances remain brilliant. The films are still funny, still moving, still technically masterful. But they were created by a man who seemed incapable of maintaining the self he performed, who vanished when the cameras stopped and left only coldness and rage in his place. How much cruelty will the world forgive if the punchlines are good enough? The central question his life poses remains uncomfortable. Sellers' cruelty was private, inflicted behind closed doors on those who loved him. But the next star's violence was loud, public, celebrated, and somehow repackaged as masculinity. And the British public couldn't get enough of it. Oliver Reed, when destruction became entertainment. Oliver Reed was the walking embodiment of larger than life. He had the face of a Byronic villain, the physical presence of someone who might genuinely throw a punch at any moment. His film career spanned Shakespeare and exploitation in roughly equal measure. He could deliver brilliant performances in Women in Love or The Devils, then show up intoxicated on talk shows and become the story himself. You never quite knew which Oliver Reed you were getting, and that unpredictability became central to his brand. His appearance on Aspel and Company on April 14, 1987, remains one of the most uncomfortable moments in British television history. He arrived visibly impaired, grabbed the host, slurred his way through questions, and became increasingly aggressive. Off-camera, the stories grew darker. Reed was arrested multiple times for assault and public disorder. In 1985, a barmaid in Dorset pressed charges after Reed had grabbed her and thrown her against a wall during one of his drinking binges. Her wrist was fractured, her collarbone bruised. Reed paid a fine, gave an interview joking about it. The industry shrugged. That barmaid? She never worked in a pub again, too afraid of what might happen if another intoxicated celebrity walked in. But Oliver Reed's career continued uninterrupted because audiences loved the drama. Co-stars and directors documented behavior that wasn't just difficult, but genuinely frightening. There were injuries. There were colleagues who learned to avoid him. Productions had to pad their shooting schedules around his drinking. And yet, astonishingly, this wasn't treated as a liability. It was marketed as an asset. Reed was the hellraiser, the dangerous gentleman. The British public loved the drama, even when it wasn't acting. Oliver Reed passed away on May 2, 1999, in Valletta, Malta, during the filming of Gladiator. He had been in a pub, engaged in an arm wrestling drinking contest, and suffered a heart attack. His passing was treated in obituaries as somehow poetically inevitable, the hellraiser going out in character. But there's no poetry in enabling someone's self-destruction for profit. Oliver Reed's life demonstrates how thoroughly we can confuse destructiveness with authenticity, how we can market someone's worst impulses as admirable masculinity right up until the moment those impulses end their life. If these revelations have changed how you see British television's golden age, please like this video and share it with others who remember these stars. The truth deserves to be known, even when, especially when, it's uncomfortable. Reed's behavior was loud, celebrated, impossible to miss. But the next star's dysfunction was quieter, a transactional loneliness that nobody wanted to examine beneath the slapstick. And it would lead to something that took 2 days for anyone to notice. Benny Hill, the loneliness money couldn't fix. For 34 years, from 1955 to 1989, The Benny Hill Show was a British television institution. The format was simple. Sped-up footage of Benny Hill literally chasing scantily clad women around various sets, all accompanied by the now iconic yakety sax. There were double entendres, sight gags, Hill's Angels, the young women who appeared in each episode primarily as decoration. It was harmless smut, the critics said. Just a bit of fun. And for decades, audiences across Britain and in syndication worldwide seemed to agree. Behind the slapstick, behind the carefully choreographed chases and the leering grins, was a man whose real life bore little resemblance to the fun-loving persona he performed. Biographical research by journalists, including Mark Lewisohn and Jane Robbins, drawing on interviews with people who knew Hill, revealed a life that was less cartoon than cautionary tale. According to people who knew Hill, he would invite young women to dinner with promises of career advancement. During the meal, he'd slide an envelope across the table. Inside, cash, and a very direct proposal about what he expected in return. If they refused, the career help evaporated. If they accepted, Hill would treat the entire encounter as a business transaction. No warmth, no connection, just an exchange. Associates and acquaintances described relationships that were consistently transactional. Money or gifts offered in return for something else. The tone of these accounts, as journalist Jane Robbins noted, fell somewhere between pity and disgust. The women who knew him describe a man incapable of intimacy who had figured out how to purchase the illusion of it. Hill never married. He had no documented long-term romantic relationships. As he aged and his show's format fell increasingly out of favor, he became more reclusive. The Benny Hill Show was canceled in January 1989, amid mounting criticism that its brand of comedy had aged into something that looked less like innocent fun and more like outdated attitudes. Hill retreated to his flat in Teddington, living comfortably on his considerable savings, but increasingly isolated. On April 20th, 1992, at age 68, Benny Hill passed away alone in his flat. His body wasn't discovered for approximately 2 days until a neighbor noticed uncollected milk bottles and called authorities. He was found with his television still on. The estate he left behind was valued at £7.5 million, distributed to various family members. None of that money could purchase what he'd apparently lacked throughout his life: the ability to form genuine human connections. And when he passed alone with the television on, nobody was surprised. You can't buy genuine human connection. And Benny Hill had spent his life trying. The show that made him famous had been about speed, about frantic chases and rapid-fire gags. But Benny Hill's personal loneliness moved very slowly, accumulating over decades until it filled every room of his flat. The man who had made millions laugh passed away alone, and it was 2 days before anyone noticed. The transactional approach to human relationships that marked his life ensured that when he was gone, there was no one waiting by the phone wondering why he hadn't called. Hill passed alone because he never learned how to truly connect with another human being. But our final story is about a different kind of isolation, someone who felt everything too deeply and couldn't escape his own mind. Tony Hancock, when comedy became unbearable. Imagine being so good at playing miserable that millions found it hilarious. Now imagine that the misery was real, that every script was just you, writing down your actual thoughts, and people laughed. That was Tony Hancock's reality. The more authentic his depression, the more successful the show. The more he drank to cope with performing his own pain, the less he could perform, until he couldn't perform at all. And then, the world moved on, because entertainment doesn't stop when the entertainer breaks. Tony Hancock was the master of comic timing, the man whose dry, twitchy delivery defined a generation of British comedy. Hancock's Half Hour, which ran on BBC Radio from 1954 to 1959, and on television from 1956 to 1961, became a cultural landmark. He made being discontented into an art form. His character was the neurotic everyman of post-war Britain, turning small grievances into existential comedy, transforming minor frustrations into profound philosophical quandaries. Audiences saw themselves in Hancock's dissatisfaction, found catharsis in his ability to voice their own small anxieties. But behind the character was a man who wasn't just playing someone slowly unraveling, he was living it. Biographers, including John Fisher, Cliff Goodwin, and Edward Jaffe, describe alcoholism as a constant presence from early in Hancock's career. His 2 marriages collapsed under the weight of his drinking and instability. He married Cicely Romanis in 1950 and divorced her in 1965. He married Freddie Ross in 1965. They divorced in 1968. His professional relationships followed similar trajectories of initial promise giving way to dissolution. In 1961, at the peak of his television success, Hancock made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He fired writers Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, the partnership that had crafted the scripts which made him famous. He also severed his professional relationship with Sid James, his most frequent co-star. Hancock believed he could move beyond the format of Hancock's Half Hour, could prove his talent in different contexts. Instead, he discovered that the format had been perfectly calibrated to his particular strengths. Without Galton and Simpson's scripts, his career began a decline that no amount of talent could reverse. By the late 1960s, Hancock was working less frequently and drinking more heavily. His coping mechanisms had failed completely. In June 1968, he traveled to Australia for a tour he hoped might revive his career. On June 25, 1968, he was found in his flat at Belvedere Court in Sydney. He had passed away from an overdose of barbiturates combined with alcohol. He was 44 years old. He left a note. The words he wrote have been quoted in various forms, but the essential message was clear. Things seemed to go wrong too many times. The public that had loved Hancock's neurotic persona, the press that loved the tragic irony, largely missed what the people who actually lived with him understood. They saw a man who couldn't outrun his own dissatisfaction, who wore melancholy like a uniform, who slowly turned his brilliance inward until it became a weapon against himself. Tony Hancock's passing was a preventable tragedy, the loss of a genius that the world didn't know how to protect, didn't understand how to save himself. His legacy remains complicated. The episodes of Hancock's Half Hour are still brilliant, still funny, still capable of generating genuine laughter, but they're also recordings of a man performing his own pain, turning his genuine mental anguish into comedy that audiences consumed without quite understanding what they were watching. The laughter was built on suffering that went unaddressed, on depression that was never properly treated, on addiction that was tolerated as long as the performances continued. 17 stories. Some of you watch these shows, laughed at the jokes. Invite these faces into your living rooms every Saturday night, and maybe, just maybe, you heard the whispers. I noticed something off, felt that small, uncomfortable feeling you couldn't quite name, but the shows were too good. The laughter was too loud. The ratings are too high, so you looked away. We all did. The cameras kept rolling. The checks kept clearing, and the victims kept silent until they didn't. Every single story you heard today exists because someone finally found the courage to speak 40 years later, 50 years later, knowing they wouldn't be believed, knowing they'd be called liars, knowing it might destroy them all over again. They spoke anyway. That's the only reason we know any of this. If this investigation changed how you see British television's golden age, please subscribe, because the past isn't as distant as we'd like to believe. And the question isn't just what happened then, it's what we're choosing not to see right now. What other hidden stories should we tell? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is Golden Age Files, where we uncover the truth behind the glamour, one story at a time. Thank you for watching.